Craig Feldman was neither the most efficient nor the most accurate cashier at Oak Street Market, but he was still the most popular among the customers. Even though he was only in his late 30s, he was as old school as the restored 1927 Ford delivery vans the store had recently bought to transport purchases to senior citizens who were either homebound or nostalgic for an almost mythical era devoid of self-checkouts and mile-long lines at understaffed traditional registers. He had an uncanny memory for bag and tobacco preferences that were a pleasant shock to customers who had to impatiently remind his coworkers to wrap gallons of milk in double plastic and to ring up 4 packs of $off Marlboro 27s and 2 Newport Red 100s every time they checked out in their lanes, even though they'd been giving the same instructions to cashiers since the store opened in 1970. He never filled out self-cover slips with a client in his lane, even if the individual was writing a check with the unhurried artistry of a monastic scribe. He always counted change and dispensed it by hand, even the coins in the change receptacle. He even asked customers if they wanted drive-up service, even if there were only 2 bags in the cart. Yet Craig was never Employee of the Month, because even though his service skills were unimpeachable, his preoccupation about ensuring that every customer left his lane in a brighter mood than the one they entered the store with sometimes kept him from scanning the required number of items per shift or led to mistakes in tendering checks. These errors were not repeated enough to get him fired, but they still barred him from the recognition that his customers fruitlessly petitioned for him on the store's Facebook page. However, the absence of a radiant plaque on the wall behind the customer service desk never hindered Craig's dedication to classic professionalism. His client's contentment was the only acknowledgement he desired, and he was confident his manager, Gerald Whitney, who had been running the store since it opened, was just as much of a traditionalist about customer service as he was, until the day he walked up to Gary Madden, who ran the 20 items or less lane adjacent to Craig's register, and ordered him to leave his workstation right after he tendered his current customer's check without a visible replacement, even though he had a line of no less than 10 clients. At first, Gary thought the promissory note he was processing would be the last he'd see before his first unemployment check. He'd spent a torturous hour obsessing about the possible consequences of a complaint from a vindictive regular who had missed the start of the Wisconsin-Indiana basketball game because Gary was complaining to his bagger about a notoriously unpopular utility clerk who was in the aggravating habit of helping cashiers by stepping in front of them and pushing cold items to the front of carts as the checkers were desperately trying to maintain their required speed without bumping her invasive arms and provoking more unwanted assistance. Now it seemed like his inattentiveness had punctured an irreparable gash in his job security. However, Gerald assured him his butt was far from on the proverbial line, as long as he was in the manager's office within the next half-minute watching what he called a motivational video. Gary, who at this point would have done anything within legal boundaries to keep his job, instantly bolted towards the office as if he was chasing a shoplifting alter ego trying to steal his livelihood. Gary and Craig both assumed that a stalker would immediately take over Gary's register as soon as he left it, and if a stalker wasn't available, Gerald would wait on Gary's customers as long as it took for the checker to watch the video. Instead, Craig was more shocked than a client who just discovered that the price of green peppers had gone up 50 cents after being the same price for a year, when Gerald followed Gary into the office, leaving 10 flabbergasted customers standing in an abandoned checkout, profanely debating whether they were at Oak Street Market or a third-rate convenience store. How could a manager who had been in the grocery business since he was a teenager, begging for his dad, possibly think that watching a damn video, motivational or otherwise, on the clock, superseded the importance of customer service? Had Gerald lost his mind from the strain of too many frantic football Sundays? He didn't have the luxury of more than a few seconds to ponder his manager's mental state, as most of Gary's customers were loudly threatening to abandon their carts with the same level of unforgivable rudeness that Gerald had inflicted on them and patronized the co-op. "I can help you over here," he called out in a tone of apologetic embarrassment, for it was obvious that the customers Gerald had marooned on an unrepentant island of stupendously awful service had expected Craig to convince Gerald to postpone the video screening until Gary's break. 15 minutes after Craig had convinced the last of Gary's infuriated customers that a fistful of free soda coupons was adequate penance for Gerald's despicable prioritization skills, two paramedics sprinted into Gerald's office and exited 10 minutes later with Gary's corpse on a gurney. The outwardly stunned manager was whispering to them with his hand over his mouth as he followed them to the ambulance, apparently to avoid having his conversation analyzed and broadcast over the breakroom grapevine by Derek Davis, a maintenance clerk, who was the best lip reader in the grocery business and was now staring at Gary's remains and his manager's intense discretion about the cause of the checker's death as if he was watching an episode of Dexter. As soon as the early afternoon lapse in foot traffic descended on the checkout lanes, Craig summoned Derek to his register. "How do I get Gerald to tell me what happened to Gary?" inquired Craig, as Derek emptied his wastebasket to avoid a reprimand for gossiping or espionage, which were equally fireable offenses in Gerald's book. "When I was sweeping his office yesterday, I heard him complaining to the personnel manager about a 2 to 11 Valentine's Day self-checkout bagging shift that no one will take for all the bonuses in the world. If you take it, he'll be so irrational with joy, he'll give you the color of his underpants if you ask for it." Craig loathed that job, especially on the self-checkouts, where most of the customers preferred to do that task themselves and would shoo away baggers as if they were roaches wearing clerk smocks. But what he detested even more was the potential of making career-destroying mistakes because he was distracted by the senselessness of Gary's demise. It was almost inconceivable that the winner of 2 consecutive Madison marathons should suddenly drop dead while watching a video. If there was something about that movie that turned perfectly healthy people into corpses in 5 minutes, Craig needed to have some credible information so he could find convincing means to keep his coworkers and himself out of that office. Gerald was seated alone at the remotest table in the break room, which made Craig even more hesitant about approaching him. Usually, Gerald spent most of his lunch hour involved in animated debates with the members of his fantasy football league. Now, those individuals were in a Packerish huddle at a table that seemed as far away from the manager and his uncharacteristic aloofness as the distance between Chicago and Green Bay. "Please, God, don't let him fire me for wanting to know the truth," prayed Craig as he nervously walked up to the manager's table. "Sir, have you found anyone to take that 2 to 11 bagging shift on the 14th? He inquired. "No, and if someone doesn't take it, I might have to shut down the full-service self-checkouts that night, which would give the customers another excuse to spend their money at the competition. But I would still have to do that if I didn't have an extra pair of eyes at those registers to keep crooks from ripping us off." "I'll take it," promised Craig. "Seriously?" asked the manager, his eyes nearly as canyon-like as they'd been when he'd been talking to the paramedics. "Won't your wife object to you working such unromantic hours?" "Don't go there," warned Craig, because he knew his spouse Melanie would literally crap a box of chocolates once she learned he had agreed to take her least favorite shift on the holiday that was almost as important to her as their wedding anniversary, as he had proposed to her on February 14th, 10 years ago. However, if he conceded to her wishes, he might not be able to afford to buy her an expired Snickers bar, and certainly not their traditional dinner at a downtown French restaurant, if he lost his job because he was too distracted about Gary's death. It was an exasperating paradox that could only be reconciled if he was able to convince somebody to switch those hours for less controversial ones, but he would tackle that labyrinth once his mind was slightly clearer. "You know the 14th is Thursday, so I can't pay you overtime," Gerald informed him. "I'm not looking for overtime. I just want to know what happened to Gary," said Craig. Gerald glanced at his friends on the other side of the room with such intense suspicion they might as well have been a five-man CIA, wrote something on the back of a discarded self-cover slip, and handed it to Craig. "Take this into the men's room and read it in the stall with the door latched," he ordered. A minute later, Craig was sitting on the toilet, feeling like a character in a cheesy spy comedy, but there was nothing humorous or satisfying in what his manager had written. "Gary died of a heart attack," Gerald's marginally legible script proclaimed. "If you share this with any other employee, you will be terminated because I want all staff members to see that video, and I don't want anyone thinking it's so shocking it gives healthy people fatal heart attacks." The following day, Craig was struggling to avoid making the most asinine of trainee mistakes as he pondered job-secure strategies to keep his coworkers out of Gerald's office. He was on the verge of making an anonymous call to the union to convince them to organize a strike until the video was destroyed when Gary sprinted towards his register with such velocity it was as if he was being pursued by the entire population of hell. As he signed in with such rapidity, it was a miracle he didn't short out the keyboard. It was mind-numbingly obvious that if Gary was a corpse, Tyler Perry was Donald Trump. Well, then who the devil was that body on the gurney yesterday? Why was Gary, who had never scanned more than 30 items per minute in his 10-year career, ringing up items like he was bailing out water from a sinking canoe with his mother aboard and not pulverizing the bread or bruising the apples beyond a state of marginal edibility? By the time Craig's Lane was customerless, he could no longer suppress himself from openly addressing Gary's maddening efficiency, especially since it was almost impossible to convince clients to check out with him when Gary was scanning like he just inhaled a pot of coffee. "Dude, if you keep checking that fast, you're gonna pass out in front of the customers before your next break." Gary eyed Craig as if all of his marbles had leaped from his mind and were rolling down his conveyor belt. "This is how I always check." Craig was about to say bullcrap when an elderly nun walked into his lane, and he abruptly decided that if Gary was going to dismiss a sensible warning with an arrogant lie, then he wasn't responsible for the consequences. Yet 4 hours later, when Craig was about to clock out for the evening, Gary's unnatural velocity hadn't slackened. By now, his original bagger and 5 replacements had left with no feeling in arms that were usually pulsating with dynamic energy and profound embitterment towards a manager who disregarded their exhausted demands for Gary's dismissal like they were pleading to him in Polish. Even though the head bagger was threatening to email the union, Gerald had no qualms about his whole contingent of utility clerks being on the picket line if Gary could scan and bag twice as efficiently as a dozen baggers and cashiers without a break. As Craig walked past Gary on his way to the exit doors, he was about to warn his disturbingly rapid colleague about the odds of him suffering cardiac arrest if he didn't instantaneously lower his speed when he noticed whiffs of smoke rising from Gary's ears as if the appendages were overheated electrical outlets. At first he thought one of the baggers had avenged the punishment Gary had inflicted on his arms by using his ears as ashtrays until his nostrils overrode this assumption as they encountered the unmistakable stench of smoldering wires. "Gary, whatever device Gerald planted in your brain to make you work this fast is shorting out," he yelled, undecided about whether he was more perturbed by the thickening smoke billowing from his coworker's ears or the fact that the electrical malfunction was only making Gary scan so frantically that the customer filming him with her phone became so dizzy she vomited on the scale. "There is nothing in my brain that God didn't put there," Gary mechanically assured him. "Are you sure you're talking about the Judeo-Christian God?" asked Craig. "We shouldn't be talking about religion in front of the customers," scolded Gary, in an uncanny imitation of Gerald's voice that caused Craig to back up against the register behind him, as if a demon had been speaking to him through his colleague. "But you were just talking about our Lord a few seconds ago," observed Craig. He was about to launch into a sermonette regarding his intolerance of hypocrisy, especially when it was made blasphemous by the inclusion of God's name, when Gary abruptly slumped forward onto his scale and his head turned into a violently burning globe. As Gary's customers made a frenzied retreat toward the self-checkouts, Craig grabbed the fire extinguisher from its hook next to Gerald's office and saturated the flames erupting from Gary's skull in thick white foam that only made the smoldering nest of wires where his coworker's brain should have been twice as nauseating to behold once the smoke had cleared. "What kind of perverse experiments are you doing in there?" Craig demanded, pointing to Gerald's office as the manager bolted towards Gary's charred corpse as if it was the body of a notorious shoplifter who had died before paying for what he had stolen. "Damn it, that's $100,000 down the toilet!" yelled Gerald as he slammed an infuriated fist against Gary's counter. "What are you talking about?" asked Craig as his manager stomped towards his office with a swindled inferno in his eyes that was almost as intense as the blaze that had rampaged through Gary's head. "None of your damn business unless you're foolish enough to make it yours," warned Gerald as he slammed and locked the door. The acrid odor of scorched wires and flesh was still powerful enough to keep Craig from giving half a damn about whether or not his manager thought he was a fool, as long as he stayed in his office while Craig walked into the break room, which was never in use that time of night, and called the morgue. He wasn't as shocked as he should have been when the individual who answered the phone denied that Gary's remains were being housed in one of his macabre drawers. The only reason he had phoned the mortuary was to make sure he wouldn't have to Google the unthinkably sinister phrase, $100,000 clone. A half hour expired before he realized that information about clone prices couldn't be obtained from a mainstream search engine, and he was compelled to duck into the camera absenteeism of the produce cooler and venture into the forbidding cyber abyss known as the dark web. Even after plunging to the level of the vilest internet deviance, he had to scroll through 20 pages of feloniously unviewable filth, hoping his security settings were toiling like online coal miners until he found an unpretentiously listed site called 90degreeenterprises.com, which was discreetly advertising elite retail clones at a members-only price of $100,000. Craig knew enough of the sinister connotation of the term 90 degrees to conclude that if Gerald paid $100,000 for Gary's clone, it wasn't because he was a faithful member of the neighborhood Lutheran church. He closed his browser like the devil had just lunged at him from the clone ad and bolted from the store, determined to keep Gerald's next candidate for human duplication from entering that office, even if it meant that he would be the next unlucky viewer of the non-existent motivational video. If someone had asked Craig about his predictions for the next prospective clone right after he punched in the following morning, he would have assumed it was somebody like Derek Dupa, who had turned laziness into an art form by holding the store record for most bathroom breaks taken in a single shift, and was always trying to distract any cashier who tried to make him work more than half as diligently as his fellow baggers with impromptu PS4 game reviews. He couldn't have guessed that the next register Gerald would approach with a mandatory invitation to a video screening would be the check stand operated by Connie Chang. While it was true that Connie had been reprimanded a handful of times for assisting her coworkers with self-covers on company time, no manager with even a trivial regard for his employees' morale would have the insane nerve to clone the only clerk in the store with the ability to make a family man or woman switch a 6 a.m. to 3 for a 2 p.m. to 11 with a resolve-shattering look that was more convincing than a bribe. Yet there was Gerald, trying to coerce Miss Chang into abandoning a 6-customer line, which included 2 individuals in motorized carts, by threatening to make her clean restrooms for 2 weeks if she wasn't in front of the computer in his office in 5 minutes. The threat of toilet scrubbing duty had been Gerald's most effective card of manipulation to hurl in Connie's face ever since Miss Chang had suffered a month-long demotion to maintenance 2 years ago for making one too many register mistakes within a week. When Connie had been hired 20 years ago, she had done all that was legally possible to become a cashier, to avoid the humiliation of being treated like a second-class citizen by coworkers who made only 50 cents more an hour than she did. The prospect of being treated like the very garbage she had to toss into the compactor after 2 decades of knowing that even if she couldn't be manager, as Gerald basically had that unattainable position for life. At least she had enough authority over maintenance workers to make it worthwhile to work a register 40 hours a week. Would have made her quit as soon as Gerald divulged her demotion to her if the vindictive manager hadn't threatened to get her blacklisted from the food industry if she uttered the Q word on store property for the next 4 weeks. Even after she'd done her ammonia-scented penance, she was convinced that her manager refused to see her as a real cashier, even though the demotion had occurred 10 years ago. Though it was obvious that this insidious pet tactic of Gerald's to get Connie to blindly comply with his orders was infallible, the even more reprehensible notion of cloning and its lethal circumstances for Gary compelled Craig to try to convince Connie to deploy the same tactic she used on her fellow cashiers to get them to pick up late shifts. "For God's sake, Connie, use your eyes," he pleaded as she proceeded towards the office like a doomed cow approaching a slaughterhouse. "They won't work on him," she replied, with enough sorrowful regret in her pupils to induce Craig to work a week of 2 to 11s. "Then I'll watch the damn video instead," snapped Craig, not caring if his 8 geriatric customers filed a joint customer complaint against his outburst and his brash exit from his workstation. "Get back to your register," ordered Gerald. "Connie needs more motivation than you do right now." "Why? So she can become like Gary?" Every customer in the checkout area was gaping at Craig and Gerald like they had abandoned their minds and their sense of customer service. "Return to your workstation or you're fired," barked the manager, the legion of Craig's besieged brain forcefully reminding him that he couldn't afford to lose his job until he won the lottery, hastily overpowered the platoon, feebly battling to convince him to grab Connie's arm and escape with her to some Luddite wasteland where there was no access to the dark web, cloning, or managers like Gerald. "Don't forget to put my magazines and cigarettes in separate plastic bags," rasped an 80-something retiree who smelled like she washed her smoke-gray hair in a sink that also served as a depository for the contents of her ashtray. "Yes, ma'am," replied Craig, as if the locking of the ominous door forever barring Connie from the norms of humanity was just as commonplace as her request, which she'd been making every day since she'd started shopping at Oak Street in 1954. "And don't sound so damn artificial," she scolded. "Lady, you won't know what artificiality truly is until the abomination that used to be Connie waits on you," he thought as he complied with outward deference. However, Connie's clone hadn't been in operation for more than a couple of minutes before it was disturbingly obvious that its inhumanity would be only perceptible to Craig and Gerald, as there were no experts in human duplication among the clientele. The customers who had checked out with the original Connie, only because they didn't want to stand in line at the self-checkouts, felt so lucky if she wished them a nice day that they were usually compelled to buy a megabucks ticket before leaving the store, and if she inquired about their bag preferences, they would be in consultation with the bookie who hung out by the loading dock about betting $500 on the Badgers' odds of beating Duke in the Final Four. Connie's double not only saluted each customer with its programmed pleasantries, but even inquired if they wanted their salt blocks wrapped, a question that only the most overcautious of rookie cashiers usually asked, since the last customer who had actually wanted those 50-pound behemoths bagged had driven her motorized cart to the heavenly service desk 5 years ago. To Craig's unutterable dismay, the clone was not just aware of the preferences it had taken him a decade to memorize, but its silicon brain had absorbed every price in the store, even the ones that changed daily. While Craig would have 10 customers in his line, crossing their legs like they were going to stoop to a canine level out of vengeful impatience as he waited for a department manager to find the price on some obscure brand of wheatgrass, Connie's clone would be waiting on 10 customers every 5 minutes with a briskness that was even more exasperating than the diabolical efficiency that shorted out Gary's double, because Craig inherently knew that the second clone was going to be making him look like the president of idiots for the rest of his unstable career. However, its demoralizing siege of Craig's reputation lasted only 16 hours, for the cloning of Miss Chang had conveniently occurred 2 days before the release of the following week's clerk schedules. The original Connie had been a legendary multitasker who had been able to fill out self-cover slips, negotiate shift trades over the phone, and perform checker duties at the same time with equal efficiency. Her double simply left the paperwork accumulate on an obscure corner of her workstation, ignoring it as if it was a mountain of expired coupons, and only answered the phone if her programmed intuition told her it was Gerald. When her coworkers approached her in the break room, she acted like she'd never heard of self-covers, and emotionlessly stared at her own schedule, which was infested with late shifts that would normally have provoked a few discreetly uttered expletives, but were now unflinchingly tolerated as if she had worked noon to 9 every day of her career. No other cashier had been as adept at shift covering as the original Connie had been, and no one else possessed the selfless energy required to spend the greater part of a lunch break and at least 2 off-duty hours per schedule day negotiating shift trades for every cashier in the store. Her colleagues were so used to having Connie take care of what were popularly denounced as ugly hours that the shock of being compelled to get rid of their own undesirable shifts caused half the cashiering workforce to quit within a week of her clone's first appearance. As the length of the lines at the registers began to resemble those at a fourth-rate convenience store, customers who had patronized Oak Street since the day it had opened, primarily because of management's emphasis on brisk service, were so disgusted at not being able to get their items rung up within 5 minutes of their arrival at the checkouts that cart abandonment became so commonplace that even more registers had to remain closed so cashiers could expedite perishable items into coolers. The possibility of more cloning was unavoidable to keep Oak Street from going out of business. After Craig's confrontation with Gerald over the replication of Connie, it was disturbingly obvious that the manager saw Craig as a rabble-rouser who could only be suppressed by cloning. After an insomnia-besieged night, Craig grudgingly decided that the only way to avoid becoming like Gary and Connie was to move to Chicago and to take a job selling W flags at Wrigley Field. He was not an instinctive quitter, and detested his inability to prevent Gerald from completing the dehumanization of his staff. Yet he couldn't hinder the manager's diabolical agenda as a clone. After he finished his shift the following day, he ventured into the back room in search of packing material, and was relieved to discover half a dozen full box carts lined up in front of the compactor. In hindsight, he should have been more than a little suspicious about the fact that the contents of the carts were completely blocking the machine's interior, as if every depraved transaction on the dark web was taking place within. The unusual cleanliness of the boxes quickly diminished his qualms, and he started pitching them into a shopping cart. When the first of the wheeled cages was empty, he decided to push it to the right of the machine, as an obstructed compactor was one of Gerald's top 5 reasons for firing someone. However, a traditional pink slip termination was the most trivial of Craig's worries, especially after he saw the dense fog of flies swarming over flattened cardboard soaked in what first appeared to be meat juices, until he saw a finger protruding from the sodden rubble, a finger wearing the La Follette class ring that Gary had worn every day since graduation. He closed his eyes as he shoved a second cart against the back wall, feebly hoping that once his vision encountered the unblocked midsection of the compactor, he would be reassured that at least Connie hadn't been discarded in such a brutally inhumane manner. The sight of a left ear sporting the Super Bowl XX earring she had worn since 1986 sticking out of a gory cardboard shroud only reinforced his conviction that Gerald was in willing bondage to the gravest evil. He was about to remove his smartphone from his back pocket and call the police when he heard an ominous motorized hum behind him. He whirled around and saw Devin Cutler advancing towards him on a forklift like a linebacker-ish thundercloud. Devin used to be the fastest cashier in the front end until a delegation of sore-knuckled baggers held a sit-in in front of Gerald's office. Since the head bagger was married to the security guard, they were easily able to get away with barricading the manager in a workspace that was slightly bigger than a walk-in closet until he and his weak bladder were compelled to submit to their stubborn demand, which was an indefinite banishment to the back room. It was instinctive for someone who had been overlord of every sports team and workstation he'd been in since ninth grade to be the master of his punishment and make the frigid, grimy expanse a defiant fortress against Gerald's deficiency in the backbone department. Craig had possessed an opportunity to speak up for Devon and perhaps have his exile commuted to 2 weeks of cart duty, but had been blackmailed into speechlessness by a trio of baggers who despised his methods of running a checkout almost as intensely as they loathed Devon's. It went without saying that Craig was less welcome in Devon's concrete kingdom than a nest of roaches. "What are you doing back here?" demanded Devon. "Do you know how these bodies got in the compactor?" inquired Craig, with a greater degree of bravado than he normally would have used with the most ruthless varsity linebacker in Monona Grove history. "None of your freaking business," grunted Devon. "Those are my fellow checkers in there, so you bet your thug ass it's my business," snapped Craig. "You have 10 seconds to get the hell out of here before you join them," warned Devon, accentuating every fifth word of this warning with a malevolent grumble of the forklift's motor. "In other words, you're confessing to running them over with that machine and chucking their pulverized remains into the compactor," concluded Craig. "1, 2, 3, growled Devon. His apathy towards this accusation only accelerated his remorseless guilt. "If you kill me, my ghost will tell the cops about how you killed my coworkers so Gerald can clone them," warned Craig. 4, 5, 6, continued an unintimidated Devon. "If you and Gerald are assuming that the cops will ignore me because they're on the payroll of the twisted specimens who sold Gerald the clones, then I'd like to remind you that the MPD is the most incorruptible police force in the 8, 9, 10. "You forgot to say 7, moron," observed Craig as he sprinted towards the entrance to Devon's territory, trying not to behave like a panicky dimwit in a bad movie as the forklift lunged at him as if the machine and the former gridiron star were one unholy instrument of life-squashing ferocity. "Maybe that's because 7 rhymes with a place you'll never see unless you shut down that machine and confess your sins to God and the police." Craig's sermonette only caused Devon's foot to defiantly slam into the accelerator as Craig fled the back room. His asinine assumption that he would be safe once he was back in the aisles was shattered when the forklift plowed through the portals to Gerald's de facto morgue and pursued Craig through the meat department with the obvious intent of rendering him into human ground chuck. At the end of the aisle was a trio of shopping carts. As if Devon could predict Craig's intent, he increased the forklift's speed to such a motor-burning extreme that Craig, who was thanking God the store was closed and no customers were imperiled by Devon's bloodthirsty recklessness, had only a few frantic seconds to scale the lunch meat cooler, leap behind the carts, push them together, and tip them over in front of the forklift so the end of the aisle was completely obstructed. With a bellowed F-bomb, Devon rammed the machine into the center of the barricade. His rage was so irrational at this point that he didn't realize the intense nasal consequences of knocking over a cart filled with nearly expired jars of pickled herring until he was halfway to the men's room, trying to keep the Italian sub he'd eaten for lunch from regurgitating into the already vile-smelling pool of vinegar-saturated fish. Craig's thumb had just pressed the 9 on his phone when he heard 3 gunshots resound from Gerald's office. A minute later, a man wearing a mortuary black Armani suit with his face concealed by a demonic clown mask bolted out of the manager's former inner sanctum and fled the store clutching a smoking Glock. When Craig entered what was now a funereal monument to Gerald's deluded ambition, the first thing his overwhelmed pupils observed was the sticky note attached to the manager's forehead, which had been perforated by 3 bullet holes. It read, "Tell the devil we don't appreciate our secrets being advertised on your establishment's Facebook page." When Madison's finest arrived, they found a vial of lethal injection narcotics and needles in Gerald's back pocket. The number of doses in the container matched the number of employees who had yet to be cloned. After Devon realized the harrowing slimness of his escape from replication, It was just as easy for him to confess to speeding as it was to implicate his manager in the chemical part of his colleagues' deadly obsolescence and the skid marks he had tattooed on their remains with the wheels of the forklift to make it look like they had been mortally distracted while in the path of Devon's industrial chariot. Gerald's murderer was never arrested, even though the security footage of his annihilation got 1 billion hits on UKill, the dark web's equivalent of a popular mainstream video site. A symphony of deception composed by the organization that had Gerald's murderer on its payroll was so meticulously orchestrated that anyone who thought their membership was even indirectly guilty of assassinating the manager was publicly denounced as a lunatic by their legion of social media trolls. Craig's surviving coworkers didn't have to convince him to cancel his relocation to Chicago. There was also no necessity to bribe him with unlimited day shifts to compel him to take Gerald's job. Even though Craig had been telling himself for 10 years he would never be a manager out of fear the position would turn him into a tyrant, he knew, before clipping on the executive tie for the first time, that these worries would never become concrete as he watched Devon's replacement grind up the clones in the compactor after their colleagues were humanely buried in Resurrection Cemetery. The end.